Not really camping, but as kids, we lived in a new neighborhood. It was next to about 400 acres of woods and old farmland. There were several abandoned houses and barns, equipment, and random junk. It was great to grow up there, as we spent nearly every day exploring the entire area. But there was one house off the main road. But about 200 yards into the woods, it looked abandoned, but a woman lived there. We found out the hard way by trying to get into the house one day, and she came out screaming at us to get the hell off her property. She was scary looking. She wore a dirty dress and had gross stringy hair, and like she hadn't taken a shower for years. She looked to be in her 30s. Needless to say, we stayed away from her most of the time. We also never told our parents because, well, we knew they wouldn't ever let us play back there anymore. We did go back there sometimes though. We named her Crazy Mary, and we'd spy on her and dare each other to get as close as possible. Even though we never got close, about 100 feet from her house. About 10 to 12 years later, I am home from college and my mom tells me about how they took this woman to the mental hospital. Apparently, she lived there this whole time with her dead mother and father propped up in their chairs in the living room. They figured the parents were dead for roughly 10 to 15 years, but died of natural causes, and Mary had propped them up in the chairs after they had died. That meant that they were probably freshly dead when we got chased away by Crazy Mary. Camping at Yellowstone a few years back. He set up our camper at an actual site and decided to do some 2-day-long backpack trips into some longer trails. The second one we went to was the Cascade Canyon. Absolutely beautiful. So get about 10 miles into the 22-mile loop and decide to set up our tent here since it was getting dark. We cook some food and chill for a bit before heading off to bed. Around 2 in the morning, we're all awakened by something just outside of the tent. My mind immediately jumps to bears or wolves or something. Then it starts talking. I will never forget it. I think there's 3 or 4 in the tent. Let's just get out of here. None of us could sleep the rest of the night. At the crack of dawn, we hightail it out of there. Made excellent time. Hiked the 12 miles in about 3 hours and got to the ranger station. Reported what happened. They said they had received a call similar to our story in the middle of the night. They sent rangers into the trail at dawn. Never found out what was going down. Didn't hear of anybody getting hurt. But then again, I didn't really look into it. One afternoon, I was completing this 14-kilometer, 5-hour hike on the edge of town. It's an unkept track on uneven ground, overgrown in many places that you relied on colored markers nailed into the trees because the track is covered in grass. It's not the easiest hike, and it's into some pretty unforgiving terrain. We're all wearing hiking shoes, long pants, and long-sleeve shirts to minimize the risks of snake bites, cuts, etc. We were the only people on the track that day that we saw. It's late afternoon, and we're about 2 kilometers from the remote trailhead. We're coming up onto the ridge and see somebody heading for us. We initially thought he was naked, but as he approached, we discovered he was wearing budgie smugglers, speedos, and thongs, flip-flops for the Americans. He approaches on the track, says good afternoon, and continues wandering along the track. He's got 2 hiking poles, no bag or clothing other than the budgie smugglers, and no torch that we could see. By the time we get back to the car, it was dark. We hung around a bit for packing up the car, but didn't see the man emerge back from the trailhead. There were no other cars parked at the trailhead either. The country he was hiking into wasn't very forgiving either, and there's no easy way you can loop back to civilization, except the trailhead. He came prepared with hiking poles, but why was he only wearing budgie smugglers and thongs? I had a bizarre experience while I was camping on the Key State Park beach. It's a small stretch of beach with a lagoon on one side and the Gulf of Mexico on the other. I was set up closer to the Gulf side, enjoying the stars, just relaxing in my tent at night. This was towards the end of a solo cross-country trip I was on. I had camped all over the country over the previous 35 days and had never really had anything too scary happen to me. But while I was lying there, almost simultaneously, the wind completely died and the ocean went completely silent. No waves crashing, no wind blowing, no sound whatsoever. I never truly understood the term deafening silence until that moment. For some reason, my body's response was complete and utter fear. I don't know why, but it was the most scared I had been along the entire trip. I was waiting for something horrible to happen. I had no idea what, but my mind was telling me something bad was about to happen. But less than a minute later, all the noise returned and I slowly relaxed again. When I was a kid, I went to a summer camp that would take older campers, 12 to 14, on excursions like a canoe trip and or a hike for about a week at a time. It was located in Massachusetts, so we did a lot of hiking along the Appalachian Trail. One hike, there was a group of about 7 girls and 2 counselors, around 19 to 20 years old. I'll never forget. One morning, we were hiking along the trail and run into a random guy who is alone, sleeping stark naked in the middle of the morning trail. Now, you can't camp on the trail on the AT. Everyone who hikes it knows that. You've got to camp in the designated areas. This guy clearly didn't get the memo, so we carefully sidestep him and continue on our way. About 12 miles later, we get to our site for the night, and this dude is already there. Weird, considering we didn't see anybody pass through us throughout the day. The whole night, he's really friendly, telling us things like, "My father owns these woods." "Oh yeah? Yeah, he's your father too." Weird stuff. At one point, one of our counselors mentions that the site axe is missing. It was there when we arrived, and when she went to use it for firewood, it was gone. The guy had a knife collection that he was really keen on sharing with us, so it was pretty clear he was the only one who took the axe. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, he was gone. I went camping with my girlfriend at a very long provincial park a week before Canada Day, several years back. When we arrived, we were delighted to find out that we basically had the whole park to ourselves, as were told by the ranger who had issued our pass. Furthermore, we were camping on an island that took about 1 hour to canoe out to, isolated with no other sites really nearby. A couple of days into our trip, we decided to take an extended canoe trip around the lake. Upon return, from a distance out, I noticed something on the shore of our campsite. As we got closer, we realized it was another canoe, which was very odd as there was nobody else occupying the other island sites, and the park was essentially empty. Finally, as we're about 30 meters away, we saw 3 people poking around our stuff, and they hadn't seen us yet, and were just sort of enjoying looking at our campsite. After a bit, they noticed us, rushed into their boat, and launched into the lake. We were only a couple feet apart as they came out and we went in. I was feeling super weird at the moment and just said, "Hey, what's up?" Not in the friendliest tone. I got a good look at them all. At that point, they were a bunch of teens straight out of the movie Deliverance. Slack-jawed, toothless, and generally unpleasant to gaze upon. They didn't say anything to us, but sort of just stared, very, very intensely. We got to our shore and checked our stuff to make sure they hadn't stolen anything, which they hadn't. But after the inspection, I looked back to the lake, and they were just sitting there, a way out, looking at us. Eventually, they left. My girlfriend and I had a really uncomfortable day thinking about it. We slept with the hatchet in the tent, and barely caught a wink as we were waiting for them to show back up. Thankfully, we didn't see them for the rest of our trip. half an alligator corpse, maybe 3 days dead, by a small creek behind a developing subdivision in southeast Pennsylvania. I was maybe 9, and there was an empty sandbank by the creek where my friends and I would particularly enjoy playing around. This day, I was alone. I pushed through the heavy foliage, as usual, only to find myself eye to eye with an alligator. A dead alligator. I froze in place. I was heavily into Nat Geo and Animal Planet at that age, and vaguely thought alligators to be somewhat lazy. They were always just lying around en masse in the documentaries. That doesn't mean I was good in emergency situations yet. I must have stared at it for at least half a minute before I realized it wasn't moving, and it also smelt pretty bad. This is when I looked away from its head and realized its back half had been violently torn away. There was no blood, few flies, and it had definitely not been there the day before. Just a half-dead lizard, unceremoniously deposited in my favorite creekside play spot. I didn't know how to process it at all, so I slowly backed out of the brush, the instinct-driven, idiot part of my brain screaming, "Are we sure it's dead?" and ran back to my nearby hidden bike. I rode straight home and played Super Mario 64 all day instead. I never told my parents or my young friends about it, what I'd found. None of us returned to the creek for at least a week, by which time I suppose it had disappeared. After that was left was a foul, aged odor of rot, which my friends attributed to creek scum. I knew better, though. In all these stories and nutcases in Pennsylvania, for years I convinced myself I had just hallucinated the gator, that it was just a log or something. It's impossible for me to begin to doubt my own senses. It's a massive relief to know that I saw what I saw for the reasons that make sense, that there are hordes and hordes of nutcases in Pennsylvania who own alligators